Welcome everyone to today's session, Recording and Digitizing the Criminal in 19th Century Britain. My name is Paula del Valvales. I'm going to be chairing the session today. And today's speaker is Dr. Richard Ward. I'll give you a brief bio before we get started. Richard is Senior Lecturer in Digital History at the University of Exeter, and his expertise lies in the history of crime, justice, and punishment in Britain between the 1700s and the 1900s, and in how digital technology can be used to study this subject. So today we're going to be having a session that will run for 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. And just as the last bit of housekeeping before we get started, this session will be recorded and we will be sharing the link afterwards. And I think that is everything from me. Please, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat as we go, but we'll be getting to them at the end of the session. And without further ado, Richard, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here today.
Great, thanks Paula, and thanks to you and to Catherine and everyone at Social History Archive for organising the talk. And thanks everyone for coming along. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Yeah, thanks. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming along. I'd like to start this webinar with a tale of two Richard Wards, because I'm nothing if not a narcissist. So the first Richard Ward was put on trial at the Old Bailey in London in June 1785 for stealing various items of clothing, and we have four records on this case of this Richard Ward in 1785. First of all, we've got what we call the Newgate calendar, which essentially lists of the prisoners to be tried at the Old Bailey sessions. That's now held at the National Archives under reference number HO 77/1. You can hopefully just see there Richard Ward up near the top, convicted of felony and ordered to be transported across the seas for a period of 7 years. So we have the Newgate calendar. Secondly, we've got the running lists of the prisoners who were held at Newgate Prison, which is now held under the reference code PCOM 2171. Again, you can just see just at the top there, Richard Ward. And Richard was held at Newgate awaiting transportation for quite a long time, so he appears in this list quite several times over the course of several months. Thirdly, we've got the account of Richard's trial at the Old Bailey as it was printed in the Old Bailey proceedings. On the left of the screen there, what you've got is the kind of the index, or the transcript, if you like, the short index that's available on the Social History Archive for the Old Bailey proceedings. And then on the right of the screen, you've got the image of the original record, along with the transcript of the full text and the metadata, as you can see it on the Old Bailey online, who first digitized the Old Bailey proceedings. So we've got the trial account for Richard Ward. And then the final thing that we've got about him is a statement of witnesses that were given in advance of the trial. So this is one of what we call the Old Bailey Sessions papers. And this is a statement given by several witnesses who allegedly saw Richard Ward committing the theft. So that's the fourth record we've got there. This is the image here is of the London Lives website, which has digitized those sessions papers. Okay, so from these four records, we learn a lot about the offence, the apprehension of Richard Ward, the verdict in the case, and the punishment that he was sentenced to. But aside from his name and a brief mention of his occupation in the trial account, apparently he was a lath render, which I had to look this up and I'm still not quite sure, but it seems to be somebody who either splits wood into laths or somebody who constructs ceilings and walls from laths, from strips of wood. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, we find out that he was a lath render. Apart from that, these four records give us no personal information about Richard Ward at all. We don't know his age or anything else about him, really. Compare this, however, to the case of another Richard Ward 100 years later in 1874, who in that year was sentenced to 3 months in Wandsworth Prison for stealing 2 quarts of milk. Now, the prison register for this Richard Ward tells us, this is an image of the original, but I'm just going to skip over to the actual record itself as it appears on the Social History Archive because it just allows us to zoom in. So this is the Wandsworth Prison Register for 1874. You can see here under register number 883, we've got Richard Ward, and this tells us a huge amount about this particular Richard Ward. We have his age, 34, and his sex is kind of put into a tick box. We have his height in feet and inches. We've got his hair colour, his eye colour, his complexion, other marks. So it says that he had scars on both legs and on his back. We have his trade or occupation, which was milkman. It tells us about who committed him. So in this case, it was a magistrate in Lambeth, when he was committed, and so on. We get then a few more details about the offence, the fact that he got 3 months, sentenced to 3 months imprisonment. And then it also tells us, or would tell us, if he had any previous convictions. And it also tells us that he could read and write imperfectly, so his literacy skills. It tells us his religion. It tells us his weight on being entered into the prison, his weight on leaving the prison, and his country of birth, which was England. So we have then, for this Richard Ward, 100 years later, a huge amount of information. So apart from being a narcissist, then why have I given you these two particular examples? Because they're indicative of a transformation that took place in the recording of personal information about accused offenders between 1770 and 1870. In the late 18th century, very little personal information was typically recorded about offenders. By the late 19th century, extensive personal information was being recorded about accused offenders and often turned into statistics as well. But that aspect, the statistics aspect, is for another talk for another day. Now, we might think of this transformation in record keeping as, we might call it, the emergence of a paper panopticon, although the more I think about it, the less I actually like that term, and we can discuss that in questions if you're interested. And that emergence of what we might call a paper panopticon formed an important part of a wider growth in what we might call the information state in the 19th century, the national census being the most famous example. And indeed, criminals were amongst the first group in Britain to have their personal details systematically documented, and certainly on a scale probably not seen with any other social group in the 19th century. The only other real competitors are members of the armed forces and aliens. So this was then a significant moment within the development of the information state, which in itself is a key characteristic that differentiates the modern state from the early modern state. And this collection of extensive personal information within the paper panopticon has proved extremely useful for both genealogists wanting to find their ancestors, and it's proved really useful for social historians who want to understand the nature of crime, justice, and punishment in the 19th century. But we might ask a more fundamental question, which is, why was the criminal recorded at all? Why was there this transformation in record keeping in the 19th century? And that's what I want to do in this webinar, is to try and tell the story of how and why this transformation in recording the criminal took place. And in this way, it's based in large part on an article that Professor Bob Shoemaker and I published, which you can see there on the left-hand side of the slide, which formed part of our research on the much wider Digital Panopticon project, along with a number of other colleagues, a project that was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Bob, I think you're out there. Hello, and I hope I can do you justice in the talk. So at the time that Bob and I were conducting the research for this particular article, we were based at the University of Sheffield. And so our research, much of our research for the article was carried out online using the Social History Archive's crime records, and particularly this one here, it's Crime, Prisons and Punishment in England and Wales, 1770 to 1935 collection. So as you can see, as the Social History Archive website states, this is one of the largest collections of digitized crime history materials in Britain, if not the world. It consists of more than 1.9 million images, 6 million transcribed entries from over 20 different sets of records, which are now held at the National Archives in London. And so what I want to do, in addition to telling the story of how and why this transformation in the recording of the criminal took place, what I also want to do in this webinar is to explain how digitization helped us to investigate the subject and to offer some thoughts on how previous approaches to digitization have limited what we can do, what we can say about the subject, and how we might do things differently going forwards. So let's start then with how record keeping evolved between the late 18th and the late 19th centuries, before going on to think about, well, why did this change take place in the first instance. So my focus here is on when particular categories of personal information started to be systematically collected for the first time, and particularly in that crime, prisons, and punishment collection on the Social History Archive. So the first major innovation that really took place was the recording of ages in the registers of the hulks. The hulks were essentially decommissioned warships that were used as floating prisons from the 1770s onwards. So with the outbreak of the War of American Independence, convicts could no longer be transported from Britain to America. And so there was a huge backlog of convicts in prisons in England and Wales, in Britain. And so to try and alleviate the pressure on the jails, they started using decommissioned warships as kind of floating prisons. And with the creation of those hulks, they also started keeping registers to keep a track of who was on the hulks. And from 1778 onwards, the registers for the hulks began to record the ages of the prisoners. And from 1790 onwards, they also started to record the kind of state of health of the prisoners on arrival, usually just kind of a very simple good, bad, that's in that sort of thing. So that was the kind of the first major innovation, was the recording of ages and state of health in the hulks. The next major innovation came in 1791 with the creation of what we call the criminal registers by the sheriffs of London and Middlesex, now held at the National Archives under the reference HO26. And these recorded largely, as you can see on the slide, largely in tabular form, information about the age of the accused, as was already happening in the hulks registers, but also their place of birth, usually recorded as town or county, their occupation, any previous convictions, their height, their eye colour, their hair colour, and their complexion, and so on, along with details of the offence and occasional remarks, which usually relate to what happened after sentencing, so when they were discharged, when they were sent for transportation, and so on. Following this, the next, or another key development, came with the opening of the first national penitentiary. So in other words, the first nationally run prison in England and Wales, Millbank Prison, in 1816. So in the registers for the new prison, started in 1816 for women and 1817 for men, information started to be recorded about things like perceived character that was sent with the prisoner, their religion, their marital status, number of children, and any particular physical marks also started to be recorded. So what you can see here in the slide is it's essentially, there's two pages that I've split in the middle because it'd be too long to fit on a slide, as it were. So you've got the kind of the left-hand side columns at the top of the slide, and then the right-hand side columns on the bottom there. So you would read it essentially as one long set of columns in the original record. So those Millbank prison registers started in 1816, now held under the National Archives under PCOM 2/60. After this, after the introduction of the Millbank prison registers, the next major developments took place in the kind of 1830s and 1840s, with important developments in existing series, particularly in the Hulks registers and then in the criminal registers. So, for example, from 1828 onwards, information on whether the prisoners could read or write started to be added to the Hulks registers for the first time. So you can just see that in this column here, the penultimate column. Also, some comments in the final column here about character. So character not known, behaved well in jail, bad character, and so on. In 1831, the Hulks registers also started to include details of employers that the prisoners had worked for, along with some details of next of kin, including addresses in some instances. So on the image on the far left-hand side of the slide here, this is the Hulks register, sorry, from 1831. You can see here it says the one prisoner worked for Mr. Lee in Duke Street and Mr. Troutbeck in Cooper's Row, Liverpool. The next prisoner worked on board a man of war, and so on and so forth. So that started to take place in the Hulks registers from 1831 onwards. In the registers for the Pentonville Penitentiary, meanwhile, which was established in 1842, the registers here also, this is in the middle of the slide, also started to record information about the name, abode and calling of the prisoner's parents. So you can see here, for one prisoner, it records that their father is Thomas Baker, a stonemason, in Yeovil, Somerset, and so on and so forth. And in the Millbank prisoner, similarly, Millbank prison register from 1843 onwards, this was taken even further still in the far right-hand side of the slide, when information started to be collected about the names, addresses, and details of the prisoner's family, their friends, and their spouses. So here in the slide, you've got one instance: parents dead, one brother William, occupation dyer, his address, one sister Lydia, and so on. So in the 1830s and 40s, this information about next of kin, parents, and so on starts to be collected in existing registers. And in terms of the recording of weights of prisoners, this seems to have been first documented in the Crime, Prisons and Punishment collection, with the register of army prisoners, so army prisoners specifically in the Savoy prison in Middlesex from 1838 onwards, which is on the left-hand side of the slide there. So you can see in the registers for Savoy prison, they started to record weight going in and weight going out. And similarly for non-military prisoners, weights on entry, but not on exit, started to be recorded in the registers for Pentonville in 1842. And many of these developments that we've just seen over the course of the previous slides were consolidated in the prison licenses that were established in the early 1850s. So in the early 1850s, this new system of prison licensing, essentially a kind of parole system, is introduced. And in the registers of the habitual criminals that were established in the 1870s, and you can see the two examples there. So what these two sets of records essentially did was take all the things that had been happening in other sets of records and bring them together into one record. So many of the developments that had taken place over the previous century were then sort of consolidated in the 1870s. So that's a very brief summary then of when particular categories of information started to be collected, and that's basically summarized in the slide here in the table. When particular categories of information started to be systematically documented. Now, inevitably, the process wasn't as straightforward as this schematic summary suggests. Some developments stopped after a few years. Others were carried on in one prison, but it wasn't then rolled out nationally until several years later. So, for example, the amount of information that was collected in the London criminal registers was quite extensive in the 1790s. It was then cut back significantly in the early 19th century and then restored again in the 1830s. So often within record series, there's kind of ebb and flow. It's not always a case of increasing information over time. So that's caveat number one. Basically, it's not as simple as this summary would initially suggest. The other caveat to say is that the table that I just showed you is based on the Social History Archive's Crime, Prisons and Punishment collection, which itself is based on the records that are now held at the National Archives. So what those records are records that were either created by or at least sent into the central state, and particularly those that were kind of overseen by the Home Office and the Prison Commission. So what's missing from that story that I've just been talking about is the criminal records that, by contrast, were created by local authorities and sort of locally run prisons, and which were never forwarded on to the central state. And those are records which are now typically held at local archives across Britain rather than in the National Archives. And it's those kind of what we might think of as more local records that I've been looking at more recently, a significant number of which, cover your ears, Paula, have been digitized by Ancestry. And it's early days in looking at that, but it does suggest that in a few instances, categories of personal information were being recorded in the local archive records before that's seen in the table that I just showed you for the kind of the national records, as it were. So to give one example, the description book for the Ilchester Jail in Somerset started recording whether prisoners could read or write as early as 1821. You can just see that here in the slide over on the right-hand side. It's got two columns, read and write, R and W. So that was some years before information about literacy started to be added to the Hulks registers in those National Archives records. And the Ilchester Jail description book also started to record the weights of prisoners on entry to the jail in 1824. That's just in the kind of fourth column across here, weight in pounds. And that was about 20 years before it started to be done in the Pentonville Prison Register. So it seems that some developments were happening at a kind of a local level before they were taken up in the kind of national prisons and in the records that were sent on to the central government. Final classic academic caveat, and this relates to Scotland. What's especially missing from this webinar and what I've just been talking about is the case of Scotland, despite the fact that I initially put Britain in the title. So yes, forgive me, I will be up before the Advertising Standards Authority for that one. But just on Scotland, although there is an excellent index to Scottish crime records that's freely available online, and the link on the left-hand side of the slide there, the Scotland's Criminal Database. So there's a really good index available online. The original records themselves for Scotland just haven't been photographed to anywhere near the extent of those for England, and I haven't yet been able to get up to the national records of Scotland to look at the originals. So in the case of Scotland, my knowledge is pretty sketchy, to be honest, and it's mainly based upon what the prison inspectors had to say in their reports in the 1830s and 1840s. And in general, the prison inspectors were pretty scathing about the standard of record keeping in Scotland. So as you can see on the slide here, for example, in his annual report for 1837, the Inspector of Prisons for Scotland complained that the records kept in many of the smaller prisons and even in some of the larger ones in Scotland were unsatisfactory. So he said, indeed, one of the most tedious parts of my duty is to be obtain trustworthy information from the clumsy and insufficient records now generally kept. And yet these records are, for the most part, extremely limited in the subjects they embrace, omitting many matters of the greatest importance as elements of a statistical account of the circumstances attending crime, as, for example, saying this isn't being recorded, as, for example, the state of the offender's education, his character for drunkenness and sobriety, etc. The exception to this in Scotland seems to have been the Greenock Jail in Renfrewshire, which apparently did keep an unusually full record of the state of the prisoner on entrance. So the Greenock registers, for example, included things like whether the prisoner could read or write, their character, the character of their parents, whether they've been in the habit of going to public worship, all kinds of stuff. But that does seem to have been a bit of a kind of outlier in Scotland. So, taking those caveats into account then, the precise details of exactly of how record keeping evolved have therefore still to be uncovered. But generally speaking, the broad outline is pretty clear. There was a transformation in the recording of personal information about accused offenders between the late 18th and 19th centuries. So why then did that happen? Why was this change in record keeping? And here for Bob and I, two things seem to have been key. One, local initiative, and secondly, that it emerged from a desire to try and understand the criminal and to understand the causes of crime. So firstly then, local initiative. So given that the Crime, Prisons and Punishment collection on the Social History Archive contains records that were either created in national prisons like Millbank or were created in local prisons and then sent on to the Home Office, it's kind of not surprising that the records show some level of central government control. But even here, even in the records that we might see as the most centrally controlled, there are still signs of local initiative. So one example, the London Criminal Registers, which you can see on the left-hand side of the slide here. The London Criminal Registers were, for instance, initially created by the sheriffs of London Middlesex, so not under compulsion from the central state, created by the sheriffs of London Middlesex. And it was only 2 years later that the Home Office themselves took the record over. The title page, this is the title page on the left-hand side of the slide there, of the very first criminal register for London and Middlesex. And just the design of itself, the florid handwriting, this doesn't feel like a record that has been imposed on the sheriffs from the central state. This is something that they seem to be quite proud of. It's really trumpeting the fact that it's providing a particular description of each offender. It lists on the title page, it lists the different categories of information that are being recorded in the register and so on. So the criminal register is a kind of case of local initiative. And in the case of the Millbank Prison Register on the right-hand side of the slide here, whilst much of the information recorded in the Millbank Register was either dictated by statute, so the statute, the Act of Parliament that set up Millbank essentially, stated that some information had to be recorded in the registers, the rules and regulations for the prison, which were set up by a management committee, which was mostly consisted of members of Parliament, they also stipulated what categories of information should be collected. So a lot of the stuff that was recorded in the register had some kind of central government input. But even then, local, like the prison officials themselves went beyond this and started collecting religion in the actual register itself. So you can just see here on the right-hand side of this slide, one of the columns that was added to the register in handwriting, so it didn't come as a kind of the column heading itself is kind of added in, is religion, along with gratuities and other things. But religion is kind of added as an extra piece of information, again, presumably on the initiative of the local kind of prison officials. So that's one thing then. Local initiative seems to have been a key part of this. The second is a desire to understand the criminal. So we might assume that the recording of personal information was overwhelmingly for the kind of practical purposes of policing and punishment. And we can imagine, for example, that things like the recording of ages and aliases and physical descriptions in the London Criminal Registers from 1791 would have been useful for identifying repeat offenders. And that certainly seems to be one of the purposes of the London Criminal Register when it was established in 1791. It was designed to try and identify repeat offenders and therefore prevent those repeat offenders from getting pardons, getting more merciful treatment from the courts. And things like ages, aliases, physical descriptions would have been useful for that. But it's less clear why things like occupation and place of birth were also started to be recorded in the criminal registers. Would occupation and place of birth really helped with identifying repeat offenders? Was it the case that accents were so marked that place of birth would give some indication of the person, or occupations would somehow mark the person in some way? And the second thing to say is that whilst the registers certainly did inform pardoning decisions, there's no evidence to suggest that the judges had access to the criminal registers when it came to sentencing. So it may have influenced pardoning. It doesn't seem to have influenced sentencing in the courts. And again, in the case of the Millbank prison registers, as we've just seen, religion started to be recorded in the registers from as early as 1816, despite the fact that there was no statutory requirement for religious provision for non-Anglicans. So in other words, there didn't seem to be any obvious practical administrative reason why religion needed to be captured. And a final kind of just fun one really is what are we to make of the recording of male marital status in the registers of the Parkhurst prison, which is on the slide here, which was a prison for boys. And so, because you can see here in the married or single column on the far right hand side of the slide, it's all single. Because they're all boys, they're all single. Now, in this case, it clearly has been recorded because it's a pro forma, right? There's a kind of a set form that's being used to capture the information. So you've got the printed headings here. But just the fact that whoever the official was that went through and added this information went through the trouble of adding in single for every single entry is kind of indicative, I think, in itself of that collection of information. So in many instances then, there was no discernible specific administrative purpose for the collection of some information. And what comes across instead, or what came across to us, is a kind of diffuse, so pretty extensive but not universal kind of information gathering culture, one that was motivated at least in part by a desire to understand the criminal and to understand the causes of crime. So for one thing, some prison officials themselves stated that this was their primary motivation. They were collecting information to understand the criminal. So to give one example, John Clay, who's pictured in the slide here, he was the chaplain of the Preston House of Correction in Lancashire, probably certainly the most famous and the most assiduous information gatherer about convicts in the 19th century, explained to his bosses, the overseeing magistrates in 1841, that his annual reports were filled with information about the personal details of prisoners because, in his words, the prevention of crime is a more momentous care than the punishment or discipline of the criminal. In other words, he was saying, I could just collect information about the prisoners as prisoners, but I want to understand why have they become criminal in the first place? Why have they ended up committing a crime? So, for example, one of the things that he collected was information on the value of the property that was stolen by prisoners convicted of larceny in order, in his words, to understand how little or how much will tempt to dishonesty. So you've got that in the right-hand side of the slide. There is one of his annual reports. The chaplains were required to present a kind of annual report on the state of the prisoners under their charge. And some people, some men, some chaplains like John Clay, took this brief very widely and produced reports that were filled with information about offenders and about the apparent causes of crime. Likewise, there were many instances of officials recording more information than was formally required of them, again with a desire to understand the criminal in general terms. So, for example, in the 1830s, a handful of local prison officials were recording information about the perceived kind of character of inmates in what they termed private journals or private character books. Because they were not being required to keep these things, it wasn't a national requirement to keep character books until 1840, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So on the slide here, you've got on the left-hand side This is one of the prison inspector's reports from 1836, where he noted the fact that at the Norwich Castle County Jail, the chaplain was keeping a private character book in which he was keeping information about obtained from his confidential communications with each prisoner. So things like age, birthplace, last residence, the state and family, trade, their literacy, their religious and moral information, their habits, intellect, and so on, and miscellaneous remarks that he'd both gathered from his personal observations, but also he'd clearly been relying on reports from others as well for information about the prisoners. So some chaplains, some prison officials were going beyond what was required of them in their official records, formally required of them, and some officials went beyond what was even informally probably deemed appropriate for them to record. So this is here. This is an extract from the Surgeon's Journal for the Gloucester County Jail in the 1790s. And this particular surgeon at Gloucester in the 1790s started to record information about the behaviour of the condemned and the watching crowd at executions in the county. So he went along to the executions and he recorded how the offender behaved, how the crowd behaved, and so on. And his journal includes this remarkable comment on the case of Hannah Webley in 1794, who was executed for infanticide. And remember, this is a surgeon's journal, which is meant to be about the recording of information about the physical health of prisoners. So he said, very strong circumstances has come to light in favour of this unhappy victim's innocence. So here he's talking about the executed woman, Hannah Webley, since her condemnation. And from her own artless story, before and since her conviction, of the manner and not infrequent way in which the child was born, I'm induced to think, notwithstanding the verdict of the jury, that she was innocent of the charge. And then he goes on to explain how the spectators were behaving in the prison on the day of the execution. So that then's the kind of the broad outlines of how and why the recording of personal information about offenders was kind of radically transformed in the century after 1770. Now what I want to do in the final part of the webinar is to explain briefly how the Social History Archive enabled us to kind of uncover this story. So the first thing to say is, and this will be familiar to lots of you who use the Social History Archive or Find My Past and so on, one of the biggest benefits is being able to access so many of the records remotely from Sheffield, as Bob and I were doing when we were doing our research, was obviously helpful in saving us lots of trips to London. Having remote access to the records also made it much easier to track changes in particular records over time. When you've got something online on a screen, it's very easy to flick between one record from the 1870s and another one from the 1770s and so on. Much easier than it is to do in the physical archive, when you're usually limited to having kind of one record at your desk at any one time. And combining the Social History Archive with other digitized collections, so things like Ancestry, but many others that have been undertaken both inside and outside the UK, also makes it possible to kind of relatively easily see how record keeping varied across regional contexts, across national contexts, and so on. Makes it very easy to look across different geographical contexts. One of the great things about the Social History Archive is having good quality colour images of the records, which enables you to see things like marginalia, pencil notes, underlining, all that kind of stuff is really beneficial, as opposed to having kind of grayscale scans of microfilm, for example, which can be common in some digitization projects. And I have to say, probably a simple thing, but probably the most useful thing, for me at least, is having the browse option in the Crime, Prisons and Punishment collection on the Social History Archive. And in particular, having the browse function set by archival reference, which is the language in which academics mostly tend to speak about records. So it made it very easy for example, to move between the descriptions of the records on the National Archives online catalogue and images of the records on the Social History Archive itself, just using this browse function, using the browse archive reference function. And actually, for any of you that have maybe got tutors, academics that have got students like dissertation students and so on, this is really great. Having a browse function for students makes it a much more helpful way for dissertation students to access the material than the kind of classic name search that you tend to find on sort of Find My Past. Now, having said all that, lots of great stuff, but having said all that, as useful as Social History Archive has been, in combination with the other digitised collections, in helping us to understand the development of the paper Panopticon in the 19th century, there are limits to this. And just two things to say here. I say me at this point because this is where the webinar departs from the article that Bob Shoemaker and I published on criminal record keeping. And I don't want to assume that Bob agrees with what I have to say next. The second thing to say is that in many ways, the issues that I'm going to talk about now are issues with how digitization has been conducted in general terms, and it's not just confined to the Social History Archive. And I know, actually speak, having met with Paola a number of times and Ian and the team at the Social History Archive, they're really keen to think about how can they develop the resource for historians, for academics, right? So I offer this in the spirit of kind of constructive ideas, and putting my wish list forward before anyone else gets the chance to. So if we think in general terms about the digitization of crime history records over the past sort of 20 years or so, generally speaking, it's tended to focus on the content of the records, either in making the full text keyword searchable, so creating machine readable text, often in many cases the full text, or in creating metadata that allows us to mine the records for factual information. So to do the classic thing of the keyword search, where we can find the needle in the haystack, to find a particular name, to find patterns in crime and so on. So that work over the past 20 years has proved incredibly useful for genealogists looking to find a particular ancestor, or for social historians like me, looking to understand the nature of crime, justice and punishment in the past. It's enabled things like the Digital Panopticon project, which has connected up the records that are held in the Social History Archive with the records that are held in Australia and so on, to kind of piece together the life archives of offenders. It's enabled a huge amount of really useful stuff. But in focusing on the creation of machine readable text and on metadata that's specifically related to the content of the records, what it's resulted in is less focus on the format of the records, less on the medium, their format, their layout, and so on. And we haven't developed in the same way ways to search and analyze the format of the records like we can with searching for a particular name or for finding patterns in a particular offence and so on. And the case that I want to make is that that's problematic, because understanding how the historical records were created, how were these things constructed, is essential for understanding their limitations as sources of information. And that then is crucial for understanding the content itself. Now, relying on browsing the images of the records is useful to some extent, but it can only give us a kind of impressionistic sense of things. I can't look through all 1.9 million page images on the Social History Archive's Crime, Prisons and Punishment collection. So what I think we need then, as Professor Andrew Prescott has suggested, is a kind of archivist's approach to digitization, as much as a digitization that serves the needs of the genealogist or the social historian. So what then might digitization for an archivist's history of crime and punishment entail? So in addition to the high quality images like you already have on the Social History Archive, it would, I think, require capturing metadata that relates to the textuality of the record and not just the content. So that would be things like metadata to tag a particular piece of text as marginalia. So you can see in the example here, this is on the right-hand side of the slide, this is a little extract from the London Criminal Register in 1791. And you can see under the entry that for Bridget Pendergrass, this is the name column, Bridget Pendergrass, you can just make out underneath the name, this prisoner was delivered of a child August 13th, 1791. So she'd had a child presumably in prison. Now that piece of information is crucial to understanding what happened to Bridget, to how she was dealt with within the system. It appears within the name column, so it's clearly a piece of marginalia. And in my mind, what I'd like to be able to do is to indicate that as a piece of marginalia and to pull out all similar pieces of marginalia across the London criminal registers to get a better understanding of, well, what information did the compiler of the record see as important beyond the set column headings? There was no column heading in the criminal register for did this prisoner give birth to a child? And yet the compiler of this record is clearly seen as important and added it in where he thought it was kind of most appropriate. So that's one thing that we might capture, is indicating something of marginalia. We could capture metadata that indicates the existence of different handwriting within a record, the use of different ink colors, for example. That might give us a sense of to what extent records were created iteratively by different hands, by different officials. We might have metadata to indicate when text is printed versus when it's handwritten, to indicate null entries within columns and so on, to differentiate between tick boxes and free text boxes and so on. So just a quick couple of concluding thoughts then. So having spent the past several years now looking at criminal record keeping, there are kind of two things that strike me most. First of all, just how much personal information was being recorded about offenders in the 19th century. And when you're faced with those records that have so much personal information, it's hard not to be pulled straight into the mindset of seeing these things as kind of rich quarries of information to be mined. But what's also striking is the varied nature of the records. So to give one example, in 1840, the Home Office issued a new directive for all prison chaplains in England and Wales to keep a character book about the prisoners. But basically, beyond telling prison chaplains you must keep a character book, the Home Office didn't give any instructions about how they should do that. It didn't tell them what format the record should appear in. It didn't tell them how to define character. It didn't tell them specifically what information to collect. And so the character books that were kept varied, took a number of different forms as a result. So a few examples. This is the character book from the Chester City Jail, which, as you can see, was kind of set out in a tabular format with one column on with what character, previous character and habits. This, meanwhile, is the character book that was produced by the Kirkdale County Jail and House of Correction. Here, the chaplain created it more as kind of free text, sort of mini biographies almost, like sort of half a page per convict, kind of free text comments. This one here is the character book for the Buckinghamshire County Jail, and here it was kind of more of like a form layout, so various kind of different columns, tick boxes, and then a remarks box with kind of space for more sort of free text comments. So different ways in which the records were created. And in every instance, the way in which the character book was constructed shaped the nature of the information that was recorded, and thus the perspective that we get on the subject. And in this sense, no record, no single quarry is exactly like another. These administrative records represent kind of what we might think of as textual constructions. And I think we should try and see them in some ways as literary genres. They're kind of constructed in a particular way. So what we need, I think, is a better understanding of how medium and content are related. And in that respect, we need a digitization that enables automated analysis of medium as well as content. And I'll finish there. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that absolutely brilliant talk. I think a lot of claps coming from the audience, which I wholeheartedly extend as well. That was brilliant. Really, really fascinating overview of that century almost of developments in record keeping and the consolidation of those changes. And also I think a lot of food for thought as well, as you say, on where we are at with digitization, but also where can we go next and how we continue improving something that is almost constantly evolving. So that was absolutely fantastic. I was gonna say I was going to take chair's privilege, but we already have a question on the chat. So please, everyone, I'll read that shortly. But if anyone else has any questions, please go ahead. James Baker says, "Thanks, Richard. Excellent work." And he agrees with you on your points on the limitations of digitization for text content over the material features of the objects, for example, the layout. He says, perhaps an unfair question, sorry, but he's curious about how this change in the extent slash variety of data collection about individuals in English prisons is either similar or different to data collection about individuals in other quote unquote state institutions in the period, so asylums, orphanages, etc. That is the change you discuss particular to the prison system or perhaps wider, part of a wider picture? So I'll give you the floor, Richard.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question, James. And the absolutely honest answer is that I don't yet know, but I am very keen to find out. There was certainly personal information was being recorded about some other social groups by the early 19th century. So military personnel in particular, particularly in the wake of the French Wars, and also to some extent as well with aliens, so foreign nationals essentially. Again, in the wake of the French Wars. I haven't looked myself at records for like asylums, workhouses, orphanages yet. But I'm really keen to connect up with people who are specialists in those areas to find out what was going on with those records. And actually, I think that's the kind of thing where creating a sort of a network of people that are interested in record keeping is probably a better approach than me going out and trying to sort of figure those things out myself. So I'm sorry I can't answer your question, James, but it's a great one about whether. I mean, I think there is something potentially in the fact that it's in these institutions where you have a captured, in a sense, captured population, and you also have the staff that are able to carry this stuff out. So prison chaplains in particular are kind of crucial to this happening in prisons. So prisons start mandating that, the Home Office starts mandating that prisons should have a prison chaplain, and then they often take on the work of doing this recording.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Richard, James says, thanks. I'm aware it was a bit unfair. We have a few more questions, but I'll just add very quickly. We have a digitized collection from Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and which we are currently actually expanding. So it would be an interesting one, just as a start, like a quick starting point to even have a look there, because I remember when we were expanding the digitization, we were looking at some character books, and as you were discussing, the chaplains of the prisons character books, I thought, oh, this rings a bell from asylums as well. So obviously this is purely gut based, but that sounds definitely as something that would be very fascinating to see more research into that potentially. So fantastic. And a question from Laura Barker Wood. Really interesting talk. Thank you. Two small mini questions. The first, is there any particular type of document out there that you are waiting to be digitized? Almost a treasure trove of information that you would love someone to prioritize. And she asked, have you researched any further the content of the data you see in the registers and look to see the patterns emerging from the data? So over to you, Richard.
Thanks. Yes, thanks, Laura. On the first question, I mean, I'm biased in this because it's what I'm working on at the moment, but those character books for me are just amazing. I mean, in some instances, they're the richest records we have. And in particular, some chaplains were effectively getting the prisoners to write their own biographies in a couple of instances. So they're almost like mini autobiographies that were produced by the prisoners. So they're incredibly rich in some instances. I think there's about 12. I found about 12 sets of character books that have survived, which is if probably a fraction of the ones that were existed. They haven't survived in the same proportion that say prison registers have, for example. But I think they're fascinating. In terms of the second question, yeah, one of the things that I've looked at is the recording of ages, and in particular to compare to try and track how consistent recorded ages are for individual offenders across different sets of records. So I've compared, for example, the age of offenders that are recorded in, say, the Old Bailey proceedings against the record against the age recorded for that same offender when they were transported to Australia, and trying to account for the lag in time, as it were. And what's kind of interesting is that in many, many instances, the majority of instances, the recorded age is consistent. So it's consistent between when it's recorded in London and then it's with when they land in Australia. About a quarter are inconsistent, so the age doesn't match. And it seems that in some instances, it may be convicts subtly sort of lying about their age. Obviously, there are limits to what you can do with your age. I'm not a 20-year-old, as you can imagine. But there does seem to have been some slight manipulation of age, perhaps to kind of advantage convicts when they reached Australia, because in Australia, the context is you're valued if you're of a prime working age, which is primarily sort of early to mid-20s. So there seems to be some manipulation there. So yeah, I've kind of looked at age, but not really any other categories of information patterns there.
Fantastic. And I think that's very useful input as well, and on the importance of like working together from academics to publishers to archives on what is next being digitized and how that almost feeding that back as well. So that's really, really, really useful. I'm aware we're approaching half past, but there's a few questions on the chat. So Richard, if you're okay, we'll just get
Yeah.
through the ones we've had. Bob Shoemaker says, "Hi Richard, I enjoy the paper, and he likes your call for a quote-unquote archivist approach for digitization, but it would be very time-consuming to implement. So, do you think that using AI in new transcription technologies could allow this type of information to be collected in digitization processes?" Thanks so much for the question. Very, very interesting and topical.
I certainly think so. I mean, you're possibly better placed than me, Paula, to comment on this than I am, but I certainly think it's possible. Picking up, for example, different colored inks, I can't see why that would be a huge issue. Um, and again, different hands, again, I can't see it being a big issue. So yes, I agree, Bob. I agree it would be time consuming, but maybe AI does provide a possibility. Yes.
I mean, I think it's a bit outside of my personal wheelhouse of what I work on, but just seeing the things that people are doing, even on just transcribing at scale, like tabular formats of forms and performance, it certainly seems like further down the line, and probably not that further, it will become part of the process of digitization, at least enhancement. So I agree with you on that, Richard. That seems like not too distant possibility. Um, Justine mentions that they're doing some work on the Newcastle Industrial School in 1880, 1891, and the admissions book contain a lot of personal information. And Mike Svester, hi Mike, also mentions that railway employment records are sometimes good for that personal information, but they tend to survive from the final quarter of the 19th century onwards. So again, a little bit going back to that first question about that cross-referencing between different institutions and aspects of society as well. Fergus, who works at Find My Past, mentions that one of his roles is to create the metadata for new record sets, and that he is keen to discuss possibilities along the lines of what you mentioned of enhancing that textuality metadata. So that's very exciting, and Fergus will be very sure to follow that up with you.
Yeah. Again, and if AI, like Fergus might know, then if AI is a possibility for trying to do some of that work.
And he mentions that in his previous role, he did a lot of work on Scottish institutional records, particularly courts, prisons, asylums, and that those records, in Scottish records, the age are flexible, is what he says. Fair enough.
Mm.
A few more things, and a question or a comment from Paul Finnegan. The prisoner's prison number is usually added in the same column as the name, so it's really useful to confirm you're looking at the same person when comparing across records, even more so with a common name like a John Smith, for instance. So yeah, I think that that speaks a little bit to what you were saying, even with that tale of two Richards, Richard at the beginning, right? And tracing
Yeah.
these different lives. And I think that's all for questions. We are almost precisely on time, so I just want to take the opportunity to say one more time, thank you so, so much, Richard, for such a fascinating talk and for this very, very interesting Q&A session as well. And thank you to everyone who's come along and for all the questions. I hope you have a lovely, lovely rest of the evening for everyone.
Thanks, Paula. Thanks everyone for coming on. Thank you.